The demarcation problem in Islamic philosophy is an interesting issue that arose due to the increasing engagement of the post-classical tradition of Kalam, i.e. Islamic Sunni normative theology, with philosophy of the likes of Avicenna and his followers. The famous Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun noted that it was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish between Kalam, Islamic theology, and Falsafa, or i.e. Avicennian metaphysics, specifically in this context. The theory of science, meaning of the various human disciplines such as language, theology, logic, jurisprudence, etc., as expounded upon by the logic of Ibn Sina, was that science is distinguished, one science from another, by its subject matter. This led to an internal kalam debate, an internal debate within the Islamic theological tradition, due to the issue that arose that kalam and falsafa tended to have the same subject matter. And there were many implications insofar as that many of the discussions of kalam were dependent upon concepts already proven in metaphysics, in falsafa. Now, these aspects or these sort of concepts that were proven in falsafa, if the science of kalam, if the science of Islamic theology was relying upon these philosophical concepts, it would end up subordinating an Islamic science, and indeed the highest Islamic science according to many theologians, to a non-Islamic science, namely philosophy, which would be incredibly problematic from an Islamic theological perspective. This led to an internal Kalami debate, which was initiated when Siraj ad-Din al-Urmawi, who passed away in the year 682 of the Islamic calendar or 1283 of the Gregorian calendar, he proposed in his controversial treatise that the Ilahi, the divine science of Ibn Sina, essentially Avicennian metaphysics, be restricted only to general metaphysics, i.e. in order to prove the existence of a necessary existence, wajib al-wujud, as is known in Islamic theology. Because Islamic theology depends upon the assumption that God exists as this necessary existence, as a wajib al-wujud, and this is dependent upon this philosophical investigation. Kalam, Islamic theology, on the other hand, investigates the necessary being, himself, his essence, his attributes, and actions vis-a-vis the world. This is a special kind of metaphysics or theology. So again, if Kalam seeks to investigate the necessary being, his attributes and actions vis-a-vis the world, it would necessitate that, first of all, the existence of this necessary being be proven. But since the existence of this necessary being can't be proven in Kalam, it has to be proven in philosophy. But since philosophy is a non-Islamic science, it would end up subordinating Kalam, which is considered the highest Islamic science, meaning Islamic theology, to a non-Islamic science, mainly philosophy or Avicennian metaphysics. Hence, several theologians objected to subordinating Kalam, the highest Islamic science, to a non-Islamic science. The subject matter of Kalam was either the existent, according to them, like the divine science of Ibn Sina, and it was qualified in a certain way in accordance with the norms of Islam. The discussion reached high levels of sophistication under the likes of As-Samarqandi, who passed away in the year 722 Hijri of the Islamic calendar, or 1322 of the Gregorian calendar, and the likes of At-Taftazani, who passed away in the year 792 of the Islamic calendar, or 1390 of the Gregorian calendar. These discussions and this whole debate culminates with Jamal ad-Din ad-Dawani, who is a very famous and brilliant Islamic theologian of the modern Islamic period, and he essentially dissolves this problem. The demarcation, according to ad-Dawani, is not found in the subject matter in the first place. Rather, both of these sciences are akin to research programs in the same science of metaphysics. Differences between the two resolve to choices of axioms. Now, this is important first of all because, again, like we said, the whole issue was that because traditionally Islamic theologians considered these two sciences as distinct sciences, and hence it was required that they have distinct subject matters. And otherwise, one of the implications was that kalam would be subordinated to philosophy or Avicennian metaphysics in this context. But what ad-Dawani realized was that they weren't different sciences in the first place. They weren't different disciplines in the first place. In essence, they were part of the same science of metaphysics as a whole, but they were two different approaches, two different methodologies, two different systems of thought within the same science. The analogy he gives is like, let's say in Islamic jurisprudence, we have the jurisprudence of the likes of Abu Hanifa, and the jurisprudence of the likes of Al-Shafi'i, and the jurisprudence of the likes of Al-Malik, and the jurisprudence of the like of Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Now, the difference in their jurisprudence, in their various opinions, isn't difference in the subject matter itself. It isn't a difference in the science or in the discipline, because all of them are operating within the broad science of Islamic jurisprudence. But rather, the differences between them account to little more than differences in research methodology and axioms and principles of deducting rulings. So in the same vein, these two, Avicennian metaphysics and philosophy and Islamic theology, ilm al-kalam, amount to different research programs in the same science of metaphysics. Ad-Dawani realized, and this is a very important intellectual breakthrough in the Islamic tradition, that metaphysics was to be understood by abstracting it away from any historical tradition of philosophy. Meaning, Ad-Dawani realized that we had to distinguish between the sort of normative historical practice of metaphysics and metaphysics in and of itself, philosophy as a normative historical practice, and philosophy in and of itself as a research program within the metaphysical tradition. Because what many Islamic theologians confused and got wrong was that they assumed that the normative historical application of philosophy, like in those of Ibn Sina or Ibn Rushd or the earlier Greek philosophers, was what the science was all about. What that meant was that they assumed that anybody who engaged in philosophy would end up adopting certain theological positions which the likes of Ibn Sina had, that they considered problematic or heretical. But the reality was that the discipline of philosophy in and of itself was a useful intellectual tool that did not necessitate that one hold these beliefs. It's, for example, it's like somebody saying that, the Mu'tazila practice kalam, therefore kalam by its very nature is problematic. Because what they fail to understand is that the science of kalam and the normative historical application of kalam by the Mu'tazila are two very different things. Just because the Mu'tazila used kalam, Islamic theology, and they may have derived beliefs based on that theology which may have been problematic according to Orthodox Sunni Islam, that doesn't mean kalam as a whole science should be condemned. Rather, the Ash'aris and Maturidis used kalam as a useful theological and intellectual tool to affirm and establish the proofs and refute the objections of the objectors to Orthodox Sunni creed. And in the same vein, philosophy could be used. distinguished and separate from what the historical application of philosophy may have been up until that point. This is very important because prior to Ad-Dawani, Ilahi, meaning divine science, of especially when applied to Avicenna, this was used as a proper name for a particular school of metaphysics, meaning Islamic theologians failed to make the very basic distinction between Ilahi, divine science, as a science in and of itself, and as an approach that Ibn Sina or the classical philosophers of Islam had. What they fail to realize, and what Ad-Dawani very brilliantly realizes and comes to the conclusion of, is that Ilahi, divine science, is just another rational discipline or research program within the broad structure of metaphysics. And in fact, it's a science which should be investigated and can be used to in fact defend the sort of creed of Orthodox Sunnis. It isn't necessarily exclusive only to the Avicennian tradition, because it's a human discipline just like any other discipline. It can be used by people you may deem as heretical for their heretical viewpoints, but also by orthodoxy for its orthodox viewpoints. So it's simply another science amongst other intellectual sciences.